Summit. So today's session is about options for obtaining an access token for Microsoft Graph in Azure applications. Very short title. So, so before starting, I would like to thank all the sponsors of the event, because without the sponsors, this event would not have been possible. So thank you to all the sponsors, and to make sure to visit the expo hall to get some nice goodies and information. Right. So let's start with the boring slide first. My name is Anoop Tatti. I'm a SharePoint developer at a company called Content and Cloud, and I write blogs on SharePoint and Azure under the platform called Medium. And the link is anoop.medium.com, and I'm on Twitter as well under the username Anoop Tells, and my GitHub username is Anoop T, where we'll find all the repositories that I'm going to share later today. Right. So the agenda for today is I've divided the session into 4 parts. Got 20 minutes, so I'll be a bit fast. So sorry about that. We'll start with the process. I'll go through what Microsoft Graph is and what Azure Functions are, and then we'll go into the access token options that can be the different options that can be used. Basically, the meat of the session, and then we'll have a quick demo wherein I'll show the Azure Function app itself, the app registration, and we'll use a tool called Postman in order to call the Azure function, and then we'll inspect the token as well. And finally, we'll conclude with some summary and resources. Right. So what is Microsoft Graph? So this is the statement that I've just copied from docs.microsoft.com. I'll quickly read it. It's Microsoft Graph is a gateway to the data in Microsoft 365. It provides a unified model with which we can access a lot of Microsoft 365 data. So, for example, Microsoft 365 data can be Teams or Outlook or Calendar. So, all in order to access the data from there, we need Microsoft Graph, and that's what is developed by Microsoft, and then they keep adding more and more endpoints to it very frequently, and the Microsoft team keep maintaining it, and you can check docs.microsoft.com to see the regular updates. Right. So in this slide, we'll walk through how we can access the Microsoft 365 data with Microsoft Graph. So on the right side, I've got the Microsoft 365 data. I've just represented a small amount of services like Teams and Groups and SharePoint. There will be other services like Calendar, Outlook, etc. So with Microsoft Graph, we can access Teams data. Say, for example, how many teams are there in my tenant? Groups data, how many groups are there in our tenant? SharePoint data, can you give us this particular list item in this particular site in SharePoint? Yes, with the help of Microsoft Graph, we can get all the data and other Microsoft 365 data as well. I couldn't include all of them because of the slide space, so it's just 3 over there. Now, with Microsoft Graph, we can access all this, but there needs to be something which has to call Microsoft Graph, right? So that's nothing but our application. So on the left side, at the top over here, we've got this this one, which is nothing but a front-end web application, a web application developed with some front-end, say like React or Angular. And then over here, we've got our Azure. We've got our Azure application. So like it might be a web API or an Azure function. Yeah. So with those applications, we can call Microsoft Graph and access the data. So once these applications call Microsoft Graph, with graph.microsoft.com, Graph receives the request and it says, okay, Mr. Application, I don't know who you are. You do not have any permissions, so I won't be able to give you any resources. Say, for example, if our Azure function wants to access Teams data and it calls Microsoft Graph says, okay, I don't know who you are, like what permissions do you have? So it doesn't process the request. That's because Microsoft Graph is a protected API. Although we can call Microsoft Graph, but Microsoft have secured it. So there needs to be some kind of security which needs to happen before calling Microsoft Graph. And how does that happen? That is with the help of app registrations. So in our tenant, we can go ahead and create these app registrations which become the identity of our application. So for example, the app registration can become the identity of our web application or the identity of our Azure function. And these app registrations will have certain permissions, like say for example, if you want to read groups, then it will have permissions to read all the groups. If it wants to read and write to SharePoint, it will have certain permissions on the sites. And those permissions can be, there are different levels of permissions, and some of the permissions need tenant admins, a tenant admin to log in and approve those permissions. Right. So once all that is set up, the app registration is created, permissions have been given, then what happens is our applications like the web application or the Azure applications, they talk to Azure AD using this app registration. We'll see all that in a minute. And then, and then they get an access token. So once they get an access token, they use that access token to call Microsoft Graph, and Microsoft Graph will read that access token and says, okay, now I know who you are, now I know what permissions you have, and I'll give you the data. That's how the whole process works. Now, what we'll do is, we'll just concentrate on the Azure functions. Let's ignore the web application and the web API. Let's only concentrate on Azure function. So in the next slide, what I have here is again, at the right we've got Microsoft Graph, in the middle we've got the function app and an app registration, and on the left we've got Azure AD. So we've created an app registration. Given that app registration, groups.read all permission, because we want to read all the groups in our tenant. So the first thing that happens is the Azure function app, it sends the client ID, client secret or certificate and the scopes to Azure AD. So it uses the ID of the app registration, its secret, and the scopes, and it sends to Azure AD. Now, secondly, Azure AD does some checks on its own. It sees whether it's the right app ID or not, right secret or not, and then if everything is okay, then Azure AD sends back an access token to the function app. And then finally, the function app uses that access token and calls Microsoft Graph. All right. So over here, the function app that we are seeing is called as a daemon function app. So this is the one which has the capability to run on its own. Say for example, it might be a timer functions which runs once every day, gets all the groups and then populates them, I don't know, in SharePoint. That's a very bad example, but sorry, something of that sort. So these are like daemon applications. There's no user interaction. However, there are other function apps wherein you need users permissions plus the application's permission. The way to get access token using such kind of application is slightly different. Whereas over here, these daemon applications, the way these get access token is different. So that kind of authentication flow is called as the client credential flow, and that's what we are concentrating on today. Whereas if you want to get access token as a user, there are different kind of authentication flows. Everything is neatly explained by Microsoft, but I cannot go through all of them because that will be a session on its own, and it's authentication is a big session. Right. So we've seen that we can use an app registration so if I just go back to step number one, wherein our Azure app uses client ID, client secret, and then sends it to the AAD. But maintaining the client ID and client secret is a hassle. So that's what Microsoft has done is they've given us something called as managed identity. In this, all we have to do is just instead of using an app registration, we create something called as a managed identity. That becomes the identity of the function app. So we can use, and then we assign that managed identity some permissions, like group.read, and then use that to get the access token. So the process is our Azure app uses the managed identity and requests a token from something called as the managed identity endpoint. Now the details of this endpoint again, that can be a session on its own because the process is very nicely done by Microsoft. So there are a lot of sessions on this on YouTube, which have been again uploaded by both MVPs related to managed identity. But in short, the Azure app function app calls the managed identity endpoint, and then again Azure AD does some checks, responds with an access token, and then that access token is used to call Microsoft Graph. So now we know we have to get an access token before calling Microsoft Graph, which means some kind of code needs to be run before calling Microsoft Graph. Now, what kind of code that needs to run is what we will be seeing in the session today. So we've got 4 options for that. So the first one is called ADAL. I won't explain about it because it will be deprecated in next year. But that was being used quite a lot in the past, so that's why I've added it over here. The second one is MSAL, which is Microsoft Authentication Library, and Microsoft has said that we need to use this library instead of ADAL. And the third one is called App Authentication Library. That one is currently being used, however, Microsoft do not recommend to use that. Instead of that, Microsoft have said we need to use this library called as Azure Identity. Right. And these 4 libraries, the first 2, ADAL and MSAL, they use the app registration, which is client ID and client secret, to get an access token, whereas the other 2, app authentication library and Azure identity library, they use the managed identity in order to get the access token. So in the applications that we develop in the future, our options should be either using MSAL or using Azure identity. It's not recommended to use the other 2. Right. Now, that's a lot of talking. Let's switch to the demo. So let me set up the demo. So what I'll be doing is I'll be showing the app registration first, and you'll see how the permissions have been added to that. And then we'll look at the Azure function itself, which has 4 functions, each one for one library. And then we'll use a tool called Postman in order to call the Azure function, and then we'll inspect the logs wherein I'll be, I'll out the access token, and then we'll see what that access token contains. Right, let me switch to my demo environment. So here, so this is my developer tenant, and what I've done here is I've gone ahead and created an app registration called South Coast Summit, and I have given that app registration the groups.read-all permission for the Microsoft Graph resource. I've created a function app called as South Coast Summit again, and you can see that there are 4 functions: get group using ADAL, get groups using MSAL, get groups using App Auth Library, and Azure Identity. So as the name says, we are trying to get all the groups in our tenant with this function. So let's call this function, which is get groups using MSAL. So what I'll do is I'll open Postman, and then I've got the function URL over here. So if I press send, and if it all goes okay, I should be able to see all the groups populated here. So ignore this one because just before I started the session, I pressed send once to see if it was working. So before I press send, what I'll do is, if I just go back to the function, so over here I've opened the log stream of the function app. So this is where we can see all the logs that get produced when the function app is called. So what I'll do now is go to Postman and call this function called get groups using MSAL. And then what it does is it first uses the client ID and secret calls, sends it to Azure AD, gets an access token, and using that access token calls Microsoft Graph and gets all the groups. So as you can see, it has populated all the groups in my tenant. Some funny names over here, new site to get access. Just ignore those, but these are all the display names of the groups in my tenant. And when I pressed send, as you can see, what I've done here is I've put some logs. So I've said using MSAL, I'm getting the access token, and that's the access token. Now, if I just quickly copy this and open this website called jw.ms and put the access token over here, this gives gives me the details of all the within the access token. So we can see here quickly. The first thing is audience. So that claim says that we are trying to call Microsoft Graph or graph.microsoft.com, and then we are using the app registration that I showed you earlier, South Coast Summit. So that's what this is displayed over here. And then this app registration or this access token has got group.read.all permission. So that's why we were able to get all the groups from Microsoft Graph. So what happens is this access token is sent to Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph has some code which will inspect this access token, sees that all the information that it needs are present, and if all okay, only then it will send back the details to the function app. So that was getting groups using MSAL. Now the other option is, if I just go back to the functions again, we've got this function which is get groups using Azure Identity. So what I have done is, in my function app, I have gone ahead and clicked on identity on the left, and then I just turn the managed identity on. So it's just a case of turning it on, and then it takes a couple of seconds, and the managed identity is enabled for this resource. So now instead of the app registration, this becomes the identity of the function app. And what I have done is I've gone ahead and given the app the managed identity, permission to read all the groups from Microsoft Graph. Now the way we do this is there are a couple of options. We can use Azure PowerShell in order to assign the permissions, or we can use Microsoft 365 CLI in order to assign the permissions. So I'll be putting some links for that and how to assign the permissions. But it can be very simple. All we have to do is open the Cloud Shell and then run the command over here, and that will assign the permissions. Or we can have another PowerShell session, or from our machines we can go ahead and log into our tenant using Microsoft 365 CLI and assign the permissions. Now, in order to save some time, I have already done that, and as you can see, this managed identity has got group.read all permission. And now let's open Postman again, and then there's this function called get groups using Azure Identity. I'll go ahead and click send. So what that will do again is use the managed identity, use the details of that, and then passes that to AAD. AAD does some checks, sees that it's all okay, and then passes back an access token to our function app, and then our function app uses that access token and then calls Microsoft Graph. Now, that's just a very quick summary of how the process happens, but the details, Microsoft have done all the hard work for us, in order to, get the access token, and then all we have to do is get the access token and send it. So, so that's what has happened over here. And then if I just go into the logs again now, so you can see if I scroll down a bit, here we've got we are using Azure Identity to get an access token. Now if I just copy this token again, and then if I go ahead to this website and then put that over here, now you can see there will be some differences. So firstly, the audience is the same because we are calling Microsoft Graph. However, the app display name this time is the name of the function app. That's because we are not using an app registration this time. We are using the identity of the function app itself, which is CC80 South Coast Summit. That's the name of the function app. And the roles it has got is again group.read.all, read.all. With that, we are able to call the graph and then get the details. Right. So if I quickly show you the code, I know I've got only a couple of minutes. So all this will be shared. I'll be posting the link to this. So using MSAL, the way we call the send the details to Azure AD is very simple. There's no need for us to get the endpoint of the Azure AD and pass the details, etc. All we have to do is just get the client ID and the client secret, and then set the scopes. Usually it is /default for daemon applications. Once we get that, all we have to do is just call one method, which is acquire token for client. And like I said, Microsoft have done all the hard work. This method gives us the access token. We use that access token and then call Microsoft Graph. Similarly, for Azure Identity, it's which is using managed identity. The code is much simpler. All we have to do is just create a credential object called as managed identity credential. That will in turn does a lot of things. It knows what are the details of the managed identity and then creates the credential object for us. And all we have to do is, on that credential object, call this method called as get token async and pass the scope. As simple as that. And once that is done, it will give us the access token. Again, Microsoft have done all the hard work on this one in order to give us the access token. We get that access token and call Microsoft Graph. Last minute, what I'll do is I'll just go to the slides. Right, so these are all the resources that were used in this presentation. The first one is a code to the GitHub repository where I have published the code, and I have also written a blog on that explaining how this works. And here are some Microsoft documents on the client credential flow, and then finally a link which explains how to secure the function. I'll give a minute to thanks. Okay, brilliant. And yeah, that's it. Thank you everyone for attending the session. Sorry if it was a bit rushed, and I hope you've enjoyed the session. And please do scan the QR code for some feedback. Bye.